Tina and I are going to talk about today is the reliances. So how are we reliant on the tech giants, and what are we actually reliant on? This is the book. Please feel free to download it free of charge. We would be happy if it can be used by as many people as possible. Okay, so first, I will start out by taking you on a time travel. Imagine that you get into this car and travel about 70 years back in time to the 1950s. That's where we start the book as well, namely with a very infamous love letter, I guess. Back in the 1950s, the later American president, John F. Kennedy actually had a lover here in Sweden. And we know this because he sent her these physical letters across the Atlantic Ocean that have been found later on. So we're not going into like the juicy details of this love affair. Instead, we want to talk to you about the, I guess, more boring part of the love letters history, namely its distribution history, where when John F. Kennedy here, then a senator back in Massachusetts in 1955, sat down and wrote the love letter, he put it in a mailbox, and the letter was then picked up by the American Postal Services, transported with a flight across the ocean to Sweden, where it was again picked up by the Swedish Postal Services and handed over to this Gunilla van Post was the name. And of course, this history, or this distribution history, was embedded in what we refer to as the analog communication system, where it's illustrated here. And what you see, the postal infrastructure that transported this letter from America to Sweden was distributed through the postal infrastructure that was just one type of communication infrastructure carrying a very particular kind of communication, namely one-to-one communication that was distributed across time. So obviously, back then, I guess it took a few days for a letter to go from America to Sweden. On the other hand, we had different types of technologies and infrastructures that carried other types of communication. For instance, telephony carrying voice calls, print infrastructures carrying, for instance, newspapers in physical form, and broadcast infrastructures that carried what we now know as streaming, for instance, but one-to-many communication through airways. What was characteristic of this analog communication system was that each of the infrastructures or technologies were managed or controlled by different institutions, namely the postal institutions, what we know as telcos, the telecommunications operators, the press and broadcast corporations. And these different sectors and institutions were largely divided or separate from each other, acted independently of each other, with different types of business models and funding, ways of funding. These sectors were also regulated in different ways through different kinds of regulation: postal policy, communications policy, press policy, and broadcasting policy. Okay, so let's go into the car again and take the time travel 70 years ahead. If Gunilla was to reply with a latency of about 70 years to her American lover, she would most likely not sit down and write a letter by hand and put it in a mailbox. Rather, she would perhaps open her smartphone and open her messenger app and type the reply in there. The distribution history or the distribution form would be very different from the physical letter that we saw before. The content of the letter would be broken down to bits of data that would be transported through different channels across, or actually below, the Atlantic Ocean, and then transported through various local access networks to the local network of John F. Kennedy, if he were alive, and make him able to open it on his smartphone or his device. So this imaginary love letter would be embedded in a very different communication system than what I showed you before. Namely because the internet for the last decades have evolved into a common and increasingly dominating infrastructure that can take over all the functions of the former communication technologies. So of course, and we haven't put them, we could have put in a lot of different companies here, right? But what we wanted to illustrate was that our work basically studies how these outer layers of the digital communication systems look. So which kinds of institutions and operators take over from the press, broadcasting corporations, telcos, and postal services, and what kind of legislation and regulation are they subject to? So what changes with the shift from the analog to the digital communication system?
Okay, so now that Sophie has established this basic idea of communication systems that erode and change as new technologies are embedded in the communication systems, and maybe perhaps most monumentally in this context when the internet came and eroded many of these former boundaries between infrastructures, sectors, and policy areas, I want to dive into some of the empirical materials from the book that actually tells us something about what we are then reliant on when we lie in our beds at night and scroll away at whatever feed we're into these days, and how we then rely when we do that. This is what most people think about when they think of the internet, which is fine. It makes sense. It's what we meet every day, the interfaces and the content that meets us on our screens when we do this, right? This is Sophie's home screen from her phone. It's at 4%. That's very typical for Sophie. You can actually never really reach her. Back in the day, I did a field work on the internet in everyday life, and I would ask people about the internet, and they would say, "Do you mean Facebook, or my email client, Outlook, or what do you actually mean, Sina?" And I realized I can't be asking people about the internet in everyday life. So what we've done with the book is to say that there's also an alternative way of understanding the internet, which might be useful in the context of trying to answer this question of being too reliant or not, or at least trying to say something about how we rely and on what. So in the book, we argue that to understand some of the challenges and changes that happens here at the front end of the internet, we have to understand what happens at the back end of the internet. So the back end infrastructures that the internet relies on. And as part of that understanding, we also need to understand that the internet is above all a physical material network. Helle said it in her introduction as well. So the argument here is that to understand these deeper reliances that we're talking about at this symposium today, we need to look beyond this front-end layer of Sophie's home screen and at some of the kinds of infrastructure layers that we look at in the book. So there's a lot of methodological talk in the book about how we do that, and I'm going to boil it down to 1 minute. So what we've done in the book is that we tried to look into some of the components that allow data to travel back and forth between, let's say, two mobile phones that are corresponding about a long-lasting love. So what are the components and systems that allow these data packages of some kind of love interaction to travel? And to make sense of this new communication system and this new way of sending and receiving content, our strategy has been to refrain from deciding beforehand that we want to look at Facebook as a distributor of Facebook messages as one way of interacting with each other, and instead ask, if we simply follow these data packages to and from people, what are the different systems and infrastructures that we travel to and from? So doing this, we've divided the internet infrastructure into 4 different layers that correspond with many other layered models of the internet. So first and foremost, access networks, that are the last mile networks, the networks that we know from our home routers or the Wi-Fi eduroam connection in this room, that allows us to connect to the global internet. Then we have the backbone networks that the internet is also very reliant on. That's the networks that come after the first mile or last mile networks that we connect to. And it consists of large fiber highways inland and undersea, and also exchange hubs that exchange different kinds of data. Then we have the applications that we've already discussed, the things that we know because it's the front end that we rely on. It's stuff like browsers on our computers, app stores that allow us to download apps, operating systems inside our phones and our computers, and of course, applications, apps that we use to do all kinds of things communicatively, or websites that we do the same with. And then finally, we have a layer that we have called data, which is where these different kinds of applications come to look for services that can do the work that they need to do. So for instance, if I use an app for posting pictures to social media, that app needs a lot of different services. It needs services that can allow it to store images or access the phone's camera or post things to social media. And this is a different kind of business from the application business, but still a very important one. And I'll say a little bit more about the data layers soon. Right. So let's start with this layer that most of us think of when we think of the internet. So, as I just said, platforms are many different things. They are the underlying systems that allow us to access content, and then they are the very informal but also tangible platforms that are on that home screen of Sophie's that I just put up there. In the book, we look into the most used websites and apps across the Nordic region. We do that. There's a lot of different ways of looking into this platform or content side of things. The reason why we look at the places where most people spend most of their time is because we think that they are the most influential places to look. So if we spend 95% of all our time on the 50 most used websites and apps, then that's where we think we should look for how reliances are. So this first graph, all the graphs are in the book, so if you like them and want to study them, then go ahead. This one shows the most used websites across Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland. So if we compile the countries' top list, what are people doing? Where are people spending their time? And then it shows the parent companies that own and distribute these platforms. And we see that there are some of the usual suspects, some of the big tech or tech giants or whatever we're going to call them today, that distribute a lot of platforms that we depend on for doing a lot of things in the Nordic countries. So we depend on them for our work, we depend on them down in the local handball club, or to tell our partner to pick up milk. We depend on them for all kinds of different things. But a lot of them go back to single companies that have made an effort out of making platforms for just about everything. If we were to expand this look to, for instance, look into the top 500 most used services worldwide, we would see that Google has 50 services, or Alphabet, that's number 3 here, has 50 services in the top 500, which is just about everything you can think of wanting to do communicatively. Finding your way around a city, looking at social media, sending messages, finding recipes. You can do all of it with Alphabet. Then we've done the same for the Nordic countries, but with the app infrastructure instead. So not websites, because most of us spend more time on apps than websites these days. And again, we see an even more consolidated picture of who distribute these platforms that we're so dependent on. Alphabet or Google by far top the charts with a whole lot of apps that a whole lot of people spend a whole lot of time on daily. Then we have Meta or Facebook as the second runner-up, Microsoft, Samsung. And away down this list, we find stuff like the Danish state or the Norwegian state that has done a lot to develop platforms for different kind of public activities. So accessing health information or communicating with the state or communicating with schools and daycare and so forth. So of course that's also platforms that a lot of us rely on daily and all the time, but they are not at the top here. All right, and as I said, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into this data layer, the last layer in our typology of internet infrastructures. So above, or we might say behind the application layer that we just looked at, is a data layer that consists of many different types of data services that both websites and apps rely on. They rely on them for analyzing their user base, for serving ads if they're a free-to-use app or website, for profiling users, location services, everything you can think of in terms of services that websites and apps do. They usually have those services performed by someone else, by a company outside of their own. Because if you're supposed to be able to do everything as a media company, then you're gonna suffer. So these services are often supplied by different kinds of third-party companies, and we know very little about them. We usually recognize them as cookie notices that pop up when we visit a website. Can we use cookies to track you around? And we just say, allow all cookies so we can get into that website. But other than that, it's a very intangible layer of the internet. And what we've done is to use the same top lists of the most used apps and websites in the Nordic countries, or in Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Denmark, to look at what are the third-party services that they rely on for delivering the kinds of communication services that we then rely on. And this shows the biggest third-party services in the apps that we looked at. And again, you see Google is a master of this, right? They had a good business in advertising for a long time, and then they started acquiring different third-party services. One of them was called DoubleClick, and it was very influential back in 2006. And then they became a master of delivering these different third-party services. Their motto now inside the Google Developers Guide is build everything with Google. You can build any kind of app with all of Google's tools. They have about 350 unique tools that you can build with. And these are some of the most used across the most used apps in the Nordic countries. And then we have Facebook following that. They also have some quite used third-party services. Once upon a time, it was like different login services or share services, but also ad services. And then down the line, we see all kinds of different companies, mainly from the US, mainly from Silicon Valley, and definitely not Nordic companies. So if you build an app in the Nordic region and you want it to do different kinds of services, you are most likely to buy those services or employ those services from different US-based tech giants. Then if we were to look at the many, because there are many, that's why the state came up on the top list, the many apps that come from state actors, the public apps in these countries, then we might expect that these apps were then built with Nordic partners, for instance. But again, we see that most of them built with Apple or Alphabet, just like everyone else, because it's very expensive and very troublesome to build with anything else than Alphabet. But of course, we see the list of other third-party services being more diverse than that's what's over here when we look into specifically public apps or public service apps. So this is anything from universities to public service broadcasters to health services and so forth. The third layer that we showed you up here was the backbone layer. This was what I called the internet superhighways, going under the sea over to JFK in Massachusetts, right? And the different global hubs. When we look into the reliance on this internet backbone, we can look different places. One place would be, where do we host all of our content? So where does the Danish state host all the pictures of my kids from kindergarten? Or where does Facebook host all the pictures that we post onto their Instagram platform, and so forth? So what we've done here is that we've looked into the most used services again, the ones, the top list that you saw right in the beginning, and then looked into where are they hosted? Where's the content actually lying on which servers? And again, we see American tech companies dominating the whole show, of course, with Amazon at the top, because AWS, their hosting services is difficult to beat. And then Akamai, Cloudflare, Global Connect, Google, Microsoft, all the way down. So again, don't expect public websites to be, or apps to be hosted on any kind of public server system. Another place to look when we look at the internet's backbone would be to look into the submarine cables that makes the internet global. So that connects, for instance, the Nordic countries or the entire European continent with the rest of the continents of the world. When we look into these cables, we see that there's a lot of old telecommunication companies that still stand strong. They were part of the building of this internet back in the 90s and the 2000s, when it was actually built out as it is now. But we also see a shift, particularly from 2020 and onwards, where a lot of these cables, they have a lifespan of about 20, 25 years, then they need to be exchanged. The old telcos don't really have the financial muscle power to lay out new cables, because they're old, great businesses of selling text messages and phone calls and TV packages are kind of completely washed out. And then comes new companies like Google and Facebook to the rescue, to connect all of the Nordic countries to the US West Shore through cables that are only owned by Google and Facebook. Okay? So, finally we have this last mile that I said, the routers and the Wi-Fi, the things that we recognize as our internet connections. And this is actually where we see sort of a last frontier of the internet, because this is where the old telecommunication companies that are very well regulated, very well monitored with by the state, actually still own the infrastructure. But we are contacted quite regularly by some of these companies that are like, they are struggling by now, because their infrastructure, the cables, are struggling for capacity, because of the high loads of data that specifically the companies that we saw in all the other different graphs are creating. And they want the companies to pay part of the bill for expanding their networks, but at the same time, they don't want the companies to take over their networks. So it's a very curious last frontier or last bastion of the internet.
So I will take the rounding up and the implications and consequences of this dilemma. At least some of them are the ones that we see as the most prevalent, and perhaps as some of the topics that we should talk about for the rest of the day. So to start where Signe ended, we have one part of the internet. The last mile of the internet is still very well regulated. The Nordic telecommunications companies have to send in data to the authorities every 6 months on the number of subscriber, data traffic, and so forth. But that is practically the only official data source that we have been able to use in our book. All the remaining analysis, we have had to go far and beyond all kinds of different dubious websites to find information and find data. Data that, of course, can tell us something, as you can see, and that's been one of the main purposes of the book, is to show that it's actually possible to monitor and create information on these ecosystems. But the thing is that because we have to use all these databases that were created for different other purposes than research, the data is not necessarily very reliable, and it's very difficult for us to check the quality and the validity of the data that we use. So that's the first implication that we want to stress here, is that we basically need a foundation for doing longitudinal studies of these developments and of the power structures that are so very fundamental to the welfare state, as Signe has described. Connected to that, what we see, and which I think was also clear from all these beautiful figures that Signe presented, is that we see clear tendencies of monopolization of the internet, and we also talk quite a lot about it in at least in Denmark, it has come up in public debate, the power of Google, the power of Facebook and so forth, and of course also in European debates. But our argument here is that we are not at the moment actually really able to document these tendencies or these tendencies of power concentration because we lack sufficient data sources. So if we actually want to reach all these ambitious goals that are lined out by the EU, we need to first begin to collect and develop methods for documenting these developments. And in doing so, we would suggest that it would be a good idea actually to look to classic media and communication regulation, what we have been doing for decades, at least in the Nordics, in media policy and communication policy, where we, for instance, regulate telecommunications industries because we are afraid that these large incumbents, previously state-owned companies, were to grow too big and destroy competition. We could actually also do that on a broader scale of the infrastructures of the internet. Just want to check that I'm sure that I'm saying all the stuff we wanted to say. Yeah, I think I'll move on here. So also related to that, of course, this lack of documentation and lack of substantial knowledge or documentation of the power concentration. We find that there's still a lack of public deliberation on this. So where we in Denmark talk a lot about screens, for instance, screen time, and that's obviously important that our children are spending so much time on screens. It's not to devaluate that. But what Sina and I want to stress here today is that I think we need to start like a bottom-up conversation also in the public and in the political system of the actual power of big tech, also beyond social media or beyond discussions about screens. As we show today, big tech, American big tech, are actually owning and controlling very large parts of the underlying infrastructures of the Nordic welfare states. And I think if we want to be able to do something about that, we need to start a conversation about it and push this discussion. Right, and shift here. And also, again, related to this, what we also see as an implication of the current way that digital infrastructures are organized and controlled is that no matter, returning to this question of if we are too reliant, we don't want to answer if we are too reliant, but what we can say is that the current reliances actually lack democratic legitimacy because we have not developed substantial tools to supervise or monitor and discuss the power that these institutions hold in our society. So until we have started a political discussion and actually developed institutional tools for addressing this question about the power, we can't say that these reliances have democratic legitimacy. To sum up, we find all in all that these current infrastructural reliances challenge a lot of historical values and logics of the Nordic welfare states. Just to give a few examples or highlights, we first and foremost observe a lack of non-commercial and viable alternatives to these services that are performed by big tech companies. So in the Nordics, we have a strong tradition that you're actually able to choose an alternative to the market-based services. If you want to watch television, you can tune into DR or SVT to have the public alternative. And at the moment, we don't really have that when it comes to digital infrastructures. That's, of course, for the entire value chain, both when we look at the most used websites and apps, as Sina said, but also the hosting facilities, the data processing tools, and an ever-growing, it seems, number of these underlying technologies. So this leaves citizens as well as public institutions with very little choice and even less agency in terms of actually negotiating the conditions under which we act online. Secondly, the Nordic welfare states are famous and perhaps infamous in some parts of the world for this very high degree of state involvement. Also especially in media and communication markets, where we have historically had a very efficient co-regulation and collaboration between state and market actors. Yet the rise of the internet as this common and increasingly dominating infrastructure for communication seems to have skewed the power balance, where the welfare states have grown immensely dependent on big tech corporations, but the Nordic markets are only a very small part of a global ocean of businesses that big tech companies have. So if we, for instance, threaten to make rules or regulate big tech companies, they can simply pull out of the Nordic region and then turn off. Imagine that they turn off, for instance, Amazon's service after looking at the slide the scene showed you with hosting services. Okay, so finally, the final point that we want to stress is that this growing reliance on international and commercial corporations also marks what we see as a fundamental shift in infrastructure policy in a broader sense. So we tend to see it as essential that critical infrastructures are governed and controlled by national institutions to ensure, for instance, a universal service and security of supply, and that we have access, that the infrastructure is developed regardless of the economic potentials in it, right? Yet within the last decades, an increasingly important part of our societal infrastructure has been taken over by companies that welfare states have little to no influence on. And we have perhaps neglected to actually talk about these technologies as part of our critical infrastructure. So I guess that's the most important conclusion of today, is that we need to begin to talk about the entire value chain of the internet as a critical infrastructure underlying our welfare societies.